The Evans Gambit looks romantic on the surface, but the real lesson is practical. How much time can white buy for one pawn? Black answers in the usual way, so the game begins as a normal king's pawn opening. White develops the knight first, because the Evans only works when development stays ahead of material. The bishop comes to c4, which is why this opening grows out of the Italian game instead of appearing from nowhere. Black mirrors the setup, and that c5 bishop becomes the target white is about to buy time against. Now comes the offer. White throws the b-pawn forward to drag that bishop away and make d4 arrive faster. And c3 explains the whole opening. The bishop must move, the center will be hit, and white is betting on time. This shared position is where the Evans branches. Black can stretch the bishop toward a5 or keep it compact on e7, and those choices create two different lessons. In the main line, Black chooses a5, keeping the bishop active and trying to make white prove the compensation the hard way. White still plays d4 at once. If the center does not get hit immediately, the gambit has no real point. Castling first is one of the most important Evans habits. White secures the king before worrying about winning the pawn back. Black tucks the bishop onto b6, where it still watches the center and does not give white an easy target. White recaptures with the c-pawn and restores the center with a clean pawn duo. Black plays d6 and tries to finish development without opening new weaknesses. This is the first checkpoint. White is still down a pawn, but white has castled, rebuilt the center, and kept the attackable pieces ready. The queenside knight move looks modest, but it matters because white keeps the light-squared bishop and adds another piece to the center fight. Black finally develops the king-knight, so white has to prove that the lead is still worth something. So white pushes again. e5 gains time, gains space, and keeps black from settling into a comfortable shell. Now the bishop comes to a3 and the diagonal toward f8 starts to feel like a real attacking line instead of a dream. And the rook check on the open file is the picture many Evans players remember. White is down material, but every piece that matters is already attacking. If you want one image to remember from the main line, remember this one. The E file is open, the bishop is active, and black still has coordination problems to solve. Now go back to the shared Evans position and compare the compact defense because not every opponent gives white that long diagonal target. The bishop chooses a compact square here. Black gives white less to aim at and asks for a more patient answer. White still hits the center immediately. That part of the Evans never changes. Black's knight heads for a5, and now the opening becomes a question about white's bishop rather than pure speed. The bishop is safest on d3 here. White keeps the light-squared bishop, keeps the kingside ready, and refuses the cheap trade. Black calmly supports e5 and keeps the structure tight. White opens the center anyway because a closed position would only help the extra pawn side. Now, white finally wins the pawn back, but only because white stayed developed enough to do it safely. Black develops naturally, and the attack starts to look less forcing than it did in the a5 line. Only now does white castle, because the bishop question had to be solved first. White reinforces the pressure without pretending the game wins by force. White still has play, but the attack has become more technical. Notice how different the compact defense feels. White still has activity, but the pieces are arguing over a squeeze rather than a direct king hunt. And c5 is black's point. The position tightens up, targets disappear, and white's extra time becomes harder to cash in. So the compact defense teaches the second Evans lesson. If the bishop cannot be harassed for long, white has to play more patiently and more accurately. Now watch a real game where black chooses the a5 and d6 shell, survives the first wave, and asks white to prove the compensation for much longer. White brings the queen out immediately and points straight at f7, which is one of the most direct practical tries against the a5 setup. Caruana answers calmly. The key defensive skill here is not panic, but accurate coverage of the loose dark squares. White opens the center right away because that is still the heart of the opening. Black simply improves the bishop and keeps the position from collapsing into tactics too quickly. White throws in a4 to make the queen side less comfortable and to limit where black's pieces can settle. The knight still heads for a5, and this is the practical inconvenience white has to live with in real games. And here comes the practical trade black wants. The c4 bishop disappears, which takes a lot of sting out of white's attack. White keeps the queen active, but the attack is already becoming more positional than tactical. Black develops the knight to e7, and that is a big moment. Once black reaches this kind of setup, the first attacking wave is usually over. White still puts the bishop on a3 and keeps the old attacking dream alive for one more phase. But black castles first and says, "Prove that the compensation is still real." White castles too, but notice how much narrower the attacking window already feels than it did in the textbook line. The rook takes over the same open e-file white wanted to own. That is a strong defender's move. White tries to keep something concrete by taking on d6 before the structure settles completely. Black recaptures and keeps the structure healthy. Nothing dramatic, just accurate defense. White brings the rook to d1 because the fight has shifted from direct attack to active pressure. And this is the big practical warning. Black offers the queen trade because queenless positions are where the extra pawn starts to matter. Black develops with tempo, and white's initiative gets squeezed into a smaller and smaller box. White has to trade queens, even though that trade helps black's long-term case more than white's. Black recaptures with the knight, and suddenly the Evans is no longer an attack story. It is an endgame story. This is the key practical warning sign. If black reaches a queenless position with coordinated pieces, white's earlier lead in development can stop paying dividends. White wins a pawn back, but the direct attack is already gone. Black's rook joins the board immediately, because activity is the reward for surviving the opening pressure. White keeps the bishop active because that bishop is still the most useful practical piece in the position. Black reaches the third rank, and that is the final reversal. The defender is now the more active player. Black calmly settles the bishop on a safer square and keeps control. That is what good Evans defense looks like when the first wave has passed. So that is the warning. Now finish with the payoff and see why players still fell in love with this opening in the first place. Black chooses an active bishop move instead of simple safety, and that gives white exactly the kind of target the Evans wants. White's queen goes after f7 immediately. This is exactly the sort of direct pressure the opening promises. Now the knight heads toward the king side and the attack stops being abstract. White is asking concrete questions every move. Black falls back awkwardly, and every awkward defensive move matters in this kind of gambit attack. White opens the center again. That is the Evans rule from start to finish. The bishop comes to a3 again, and the old Evans geometry appears in full force. Black tries to defend with the knight, but the pieces are already stepping on each other. White adds f3 and supports everything. Even this calm-looking move is part of the attack. Black checks, but the check does not solve the real problem, which is that the black pieces still are not coordinated. Black keeps shuffling pieces, but none of them solve the open lines aimed at the king. The rook comes to d1, and now white's whole army is pointed at the center and the king. Black tries one more queen shuffle, but now tactical defense is being asked to do too much. And here the exchange sack lands. White gives material because time and open lines matter more than counting rooks. Black has to recapture, but the queen is pulled onto a worse post and the king remains exposed. Now the knight hits f7, and the attack becomes pure geometry. Every white piece is working at once. Black throws the queen toward white's king, but it is already too late to change who is attacking whom. The queen check from b5 is the kind of forcing move the Evans is trying to earn from the opening itself. White keeps checking because when the attack is this far ahead, forcing moves are more important than material. The king steps out, but every step forward only walks deeper into white's net. Another check, and notice how naturally the attack flows once white's pieces arrived on time. And the bishop mates. This is the romantic Evans finish, but the mate only exists because the development race was won much earlier. So that is the whole lesson. The Evans Gambit is not about hoping for magic, it is about buying time, spending it on the center and development, and attacking before black gets organized.